This is a 2001 Mercedes-Benz S600, known by enthusiasts as the W220 S-Class, also known as the S-Class that everyone hates. This version of the S-Class was sold here in the United States from 2000 to 2006, and it's developed a reputation as the absolute low point in the entire history of the Mercedes S-Class. And today I'm going to review this car and find out why. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your car for free on Cars and Bids and auction it. And we've had some great sales recently, including this wonderful BMW 740i with an M5 drivetrain swap, sold for over $25,000. This AutoZam AZ1 sold for over $27,000, and this fantastic Sprinter van brought over $90,000 with four-wheel drive. We've done great with vans on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. Check it out at carsandbids.com. So let's talk S600. The S-Class is, of course, Mercedes-Benz flagship sedan, and this was technically the fourth generation, like I said, on sale in the United States in the early 2000s. Now, this replaced the famed W140 S-Class, this car, and that was my very favorite version of the S-Class. It had a reputation for excellent build quality and fantastic over-engineering. This one doesn't. This S-Class debuted at a time of Mercedes-Benz cutting costs and simplifying production and engineering, and so a lot of people viewed it as a downgrade over the prior model. The styling also drew a lot of criticism for being sort of rounded and not quite having the presence of other S-Classes. Now, the S-Class that came after this, which debuted in 2007, was a huge leap forward, which kind of left this as the one that nobody likes, and it has that reputation still, and these are the cheapest S-Class models you can find today. So today I'm going to find out if it deserves that reputation. And to do that, I'm going to review a pretty nice one. This is a 2001 S600 with a 5.8 liter V12, the top of the line model back in 2001. And it has some pretty amazing features, including Distronic Adaptive Cruise Control, which was a big deal back in 01. It cost $3,000 as an option, even though it's now standard in every RAV4. But anyway, we're also going to find out what else it has, because I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of this car and show you all the quirks and features of the most hated S-Class. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, time for the W220 S-Class quirks and features, and I'm going to start with some of the biggest criticisms people give to this car, and that means starting with styling, which might just be the biggest criticism. The previous S-Class model, the W140, had this stately, boxy look, the kind of car a diplomat simply had to be driving, or else he wouldn't be taken seriously. This car just didn't. It looks like melty and rounded, and it didn't have that stately presence of the prior S-Class or the S-Class models before that one. It just didn't quite feel like an S-Class. Now, a lot of cars in the late 90s and early 2000s had this melted, roundy look, but that was the problem. This wasn't blazing its own trail. It didn't have a distinctive, special S-Class presence to it, and it just didn't look all that stately and flagshipy. And another big issue was quality and cost cutting, which became immediately apparent the moment you climbed into this car. You looked around this interior and it just didn't feel like the premier flagship luxury sedan from the premier German luxury brand. That was especially true of the controls. You can see all of these buttons and switches looking like kind of cheap plastic with rounded edges on most of them. Looked like something General Motors would put in a car, not Mercedes-Benz in their vaunted S-Class. The previous generation S-Class was famously built without any regard to cost. The directive was to make the greatest car in the world and and they did it. But in this one, cost cutting was the name of the game. They wanted to share more parts with other Mercedes models to make it cheaper, and that really showed in this interior. And it was a drawback to this car. Now, the other drawback is the driving experience, but I will cover that later when I get behind the wheel of this S-Class, and I'll explain why that was a problem too. But despite the issues with this car's styling and its interior materials and cost cutting, it was still a new S-Class, and that meant new technology everywhere. The S-Class was always the car that debuted all the new features before they trickled down into the other cheaper models. And there were some amazing features in this one. For example, adaptive cruise control. Like I said, now standard on a RAV4, but this was one of the very first cars to ever have adaptive cruise control. You can see the sensor up there in the grille all the way back in 2001, and this little dial next to the gear lever allows you to adjust the gap between your car and the car in front. Pretty amazing to see that back here in one of the earliest models. This car also has a forward collision warning system. This little button here next to the gear lever turns it on or off. You can see two cars about to collide with a little sound icon. If you turn it on and you're about to hit something, it will sound an alarm letting you know you should brake, you gotta stop. This had to have been one of the very first cars with that feature, which again is now common in mainstream vehicles everywhere. And another first for this car, ventilated seats. This is another feature we now take for granted. A lot of cars have it, not even luxury cars, but this was a pioneer. I think the very first car ever to have ventilated seats. You press this little button on the door panel, and then fans inside the seats would cool you. Heated seats were already pretty standard by now in luxury cars, but ventilated seats were a new thing and a big deal. And another new thing here, LED brake lights. Another feature we completely take for granted now. This was the first car to have LED brake lights. The theory was they shined brighter and lasted longer, so they were a safety benefit. It was adopted here first and then trickled down into everything else. The saying goes that if you want to see what normal cars' features will look like in 20 years, look at an S-Class from today. And frankly, that's true. 2001 S-Class had all these things that are now pretty common in normal cars. And here's another one, voice control for some of the functions in this car. Voice control now pretty common on cars. It debuted in the prior S-Class model, but it can only do a few things. In this one, it could do a lot more. It can recognize up to 300 commands. You would activate it using this little stalk coming off the steering column as a microphone, and then it would listen to what you said, and then theoretically, it would do what you said using voice rather than touching buttons. Again, now a common feature pioneered here. But in addition to the wonderful features of this car, it also had very many quirks on account of being a 20-year-old flagship luxury sedan. So let's go through some of them now. One of my favorite things when you first open the door sill greets you by saying Mercedes-Benz V12. Doesn't say S-Class, doesn't just say Mercedes. It had to remind you, you're getting into the big boy. Anyway, also interesting on the door panel, a couple of features. For one, the heated and cooled seats share a little button area there, and you can see they share lights, but there are only 5 lights. 2 of them are for the heated seat, 3 of them are for the ventilated seat. So the ventilated seat gets light preference over the heated seat. I don't know why they didn't just go with 3 and 3, but that's what they did. One other cool thing on the door panel is the mirror control. You can see it here, and you can see it's actually shaped like a mirror. So when you're moving around the mirror control, you are literally moving exactly where the mirror will move, corresponding the exact same shape, which is a neat little touch, nice little piece of attention to detail. Also, something you notice with the door open before you climb inside is these little controls in the side of the seat. That's for massage seats. Massaging seats, again, this is one of the very first cars to ever have that feature. And the owner tells me it doesn't really do much or work that well, but it's there. Massaging seats 20 years ago. Pretty impressive. But anyway, next we climb inside, and you can see on the gear lever, the pride in the V12 continues. The Mercedes logo and V12 right under it. And in this area, you also have a lot of different compartments, some very obvious and some rather hidden. Directly ahead of the gear lever, you press this open and you have a little storage compartment here, which I guess could be useful. And behind the gear lever, you have another storage compartment, and the lower part actually comes out. So you could use this as trash if you wanted to, and then take out this plastic piece and empty it like you would with a trash can. Now back to ahead of the gear lever, you have your ashtray here, and I love the fact that when you press it, it comes out and it tilts downwards a little bit to make it a little easier to put ashes in it. Take another look at that. It comes out, tilts downwards. They really did think of everything. That's the Mercedes-Benz way. But maybe the most interesting little storage compartment in here is the center console, which just looks like one piece, but it's actually 3. You can use one little latch under the lid of the center console console to open the upper piece. And you can see in there an old school Mercedes-Benz car phone, which is another nice luxury that this car possessed. You can use another little latch in the center console area to open up the lower part and get access to even more storage. So there are two pieces there, but there's also another trick, cup holders. You can pull this little piece open here and reveal two cup holders, and then you can stick your drinks here. Or if you don't want to just look at cup holders while you're driving along, you can close it, and then it just looks like a center console. Now, speaking of hidden compartments in this car, there are a few others. You can pop open the glove box pretty easily by pressing this button to the left of it. It opens up and it looks like a standard glove box, but if you press this little panel on the inside of the glove box lid, it reveals a little hidden pen storage area, which is a cool place so they won't roll around. That's a neat touch. You also have hidden storage at the base of your seat bottom. You can see right here, this is a storage compartment. You can open it up and put stuff in here and no one will ever think to look for it there. You have that on both the driver and passenger side, extra little hidden compartments in your S-Class. And by the way, one other little hidden item in here, you drop the sun visors, you can see a visor mirror, which is pretty standard, but you also have a second magnification of visor mirror. Pull this to the side, you can see you have two different levels of magnification, so you can look at yourself or look at yourself more closely. That's pretty cool. And speaking of hidden items, let's go into the center control stack here. We have kind of an unusual hidden control in the climate controls. You can see these are the climate controls right here, but there's no obvious place where you can actually direct the airflow. Like, how do you tell it to go to the windshield or to your feet or whatever? Well, currently it is in automatic mode and it's choosing where to send the air. But if you press the auto button, you can see it pops out and becomes a dial and various different airflow options appear. They were hidden before and now they reveal themselves and you can choose where the air goes. If you want to put it back into auto, you press it, the dial goes away, and so do your airflow options, which is actually kind of an ingenious way to make that happen. Hide the airflow choices when you're in auto. It's really cool design. And of course, right above the climate controls, you can see the center screen. This car was one of the first to have a center screen here. It is a very rudimentary old school navigation system, not touch activated, so everything is very difficult to use. And unfortunately, it also incorporates all of your audio controls. So your radio, your CD player, that sort of thing is all incorporated into this old school non-touch screen. But it's there and it was probably pretty cool to have that 20 years ago. Now, one interesting thing in this screen area is the volume control, which is not this little dial here with vol right above it. That's not volume. That actually adjusts the placement of your cursor on the screen. Instead, to adjust volume, you press plus or minus on this little switch button panel, up or down, and that changes your volume control, which is kind of odd. Fortunately, if you're the driver, you do have a second volume control mounted right on the steering wheel, which of course makes things easier. Now, moving up in the center control stack from there, you can see a row of buttons and switches here. This is usually where I call out luxury cars for having very obvious blank switches that look terrible, except this car doesn't have any blanks. This S600 is fully equipped with every single option, and so all of these are in use. Now, the highlights here on the left side, you can see one says ABC Sport. That was referring to the active body control system, which was a hydraulic suspension and body system that tried to keep this car as flat as possible, even under cornering or hard acceleration, to keep it flat and smooth. But you could put it in sport mode using this button. You also have this little switch here with the headrest on it. That'll drop the headrest for better visibility, which is a nice feature. But in this car, it will also raise them back up again. So if you've dropped them and then your chauffeured passenger is climbing in, press that button and they'll get a headrest. The other interesting button in here, you can see over on the right, that's your rear sunshade. You can raise or lower the rear sunshade from the front to try to keep some sun out of the rear area and keep the car maybe a little cooler or more discreet. And next up we move on to the gauge cluster, which, unlike a lot of stuff in here, is not shared with other Mercedes-Benz models, or at least not with most of them. It was much classier in the S-Class and looks very luxurious. And it has this cool floating needle for the speedometer that doesn't seem to have like a base. It just sort of floats in place and goes up as your speed increases. And that was a pretty cool trick. One other thing I love in here is this little pixel display, which of course now looks very outdated, but it showed you a lot of different car information like you might might need, your tire pressures, your trip odometer, that sort of thing. It also showed you this screen, which was your following distance with adaptive cruise control, and you can see the Mercedes-Benz hood ornament is indicated with a little pixel on this screen. So you always knew you were looking at a Mercedes-Benz, not just a generic car. I love that attention to detail. One other interesting thing in this screen, if you didn't have a phone connected to this car, it really told you loudly in capital letters with an exclamation point, as if it was telling you, why don't you have your phone connected, you idiot? It's kind of funny to see it being so emphatic about that. Now, directly above the gauge cluster area, to the left and right, you can see these two little panels, and you're wondering, what exactly is that? Those are, interestingly, your parking sensors. The one on the left corresponds to the left side of the car, the one on the right corresponds to the right side. And as you get close to something, these parking sensors would light up gradually more and more intensely to let you know just how close you are. So those are your front parking sensors. And of course, they're not mounted on the left and right sides of this interior because they're really only relevant to the driver. So they're mounted to the left and right sides of the steering wheel so the driver can easily see them. Interestingly, you also had similar parking sensors in back, and they were mounted on the headliner, which doesn't really seem like that great of a placement until you realize you can clearly see them in your rear view mirror. You can see it there as you're backing up. These again start lighting up more and more as you get closer to something to let you know you're approaching. Very easy to see your parking sensor in your mirror. Pretty cool idea. But since we're talking about the back of the S-Class, let's talk about the back of the S-Class because it is marvelous back here. For one thing, it is tremendously roomy. This S-Class was made in two different wheelbases, long and short. The vast majority of S-Class models sold in North America were long wheelbase, although we did get a few short wheelbase, but never in the S600. This was long wheelbase only, and it shows. You got a lot of space back here, and it is very comfortable. You also have some nice touches in back, as you might imagine. For one thing, open the door, and once again, the door sill says V12. This time, it doesn't even say Mercedes-Benz V12 like it did up front. They just want to remind everybody that this is the best of the breed. Now, also in this area, on the door panel, I want to talk about the rear seat controls. The one at the top is the headrest control, and that will lower or raise the rear headrest, as you might expect. Now, the lower control for these seats, you can see, is split into two controls. The bigger one on the bottom moves the seat forward or backwards, and then there's a smaller one above that that moves like a little seat bottom extender for better leg support. You also have heated and ventilated rear seats. You can see the control here, again with the 5 little lights that light up, giving preference to the ventilated part. Like I said, this car was pioneering ventilated seats up front, and they decided to stick them in back too, which was pretty luxurious. You also had rear climate controls mounted on the back of the front center console, and you can see dual zone back here, so you had individual zones for your rear seat climate control to adjust the temperature, and that was a pretty luxurious feature. You also had climate vents right here coming off the back of the center console, and you had climate vents mounted on the B pillars. And the way Mercedes delivered air to these climate vents is kind of genius, actually. It goes through the front door. You open the front door and you can see this little hole in the front for climate control air to blow through. And you can also see a corresponding hole in the back that lines up with the rear climate vent. So as long as the front seat occupants had their doors closed, you had rear seat climate control air blowing through those B-pillar vents, and that is a pretty cool feature. And as you might expect, there's some other cool stuff back here. Probably my favorite rear seat feature is the way that Mercedes-Benz integrated the ashtray and the cigarette lighter. You see this little piece of wood trim on the door? Yeah, that's not just trim. If you push it, the ashtray pops out close to you and the cigarette lighter is revealed. It was hiding like behind this wood trim. And then you can push it closed if you don't want it, and it just looks like wood trim hiding the cigarette lighter and ashtray. That's a pretty cool touch. Another nice touch back here, you're a chauffeured passenger being driven to an important meeting in your S-Class. You want to make sure you look good, so there are mirrors that come down from the ceiling. You press this and a mirror deploys, and you can look at yourself. And you press this button and they are illuminated so you can see yourself a little better to make sure you're looking your best. Also in this area, another nice luxury touch, even the grab handle back here is trimmed in wood. It looks very luxurious. You pull on this to get out, or maybe you hang clothes from it, but it's trimmed in wood. It looks nice. One other interesting quirk worth pointing out in the back seat, you can see on the inside, near the back of the window, you have two kind of pillars in here, one on the outside and one like inner one, which looks kind of strange. You might be wondering, what is that about? It's for the rear window sunshade. You can lift up this little piece and that lifts up the rear sunshade in case you want to shield yourself from the sun. And that little plastic inner pillar thing is intended to keep the rear sunshade kind of on track as it goes further back towards the end of the window. Kind of interesting to see that, but that's what it's for. And next up, we move outside the W220 S-Class to go over a few interesting quirks out here. One is the trunk, which opened with a hydraulic system and a hydraulic pump back here. If the car was unlocked, you could come back here, push a little button, and then the trunk would automatically open itself. Very luxurious and impressive. Now, when you have the trunk lid open, you can see nothing particularly unusual back here, just a trunk about the same size you would expect. Cargo goes in, nothing too interesting or exciting. But one notable item, when you go to close the trunk, you press this little button and the hydraulic system closes it, and rather quickly and rather forcefully. I wouldn't want to get a hand stuck in there because that thing is closing. And speaking of stuff that closes automatically, as you might expect, this car has soft close doors, meaning when you get out, you don't have to slam the door. If you're at some stately function, you can just lightly close the door and the car will latch it the rest of the way, softly and silently. Next up, moving on to some other exterior quirks of the car. There's not that much quirky on the exterior, aside from the fact that most people didn't really like how it looked, but there are two interesting quirks that you can see right now. One is over here. I like the fact that they continued the trim on the side of the door all the way to the wheel. Some cars go to cheap out and they stop the door trim right at the end of the door because there's a cost to putting this tiny little piece of trim between the door and the wheel, but Mercedes-Benz did that because they gotta get the details right. The other cool thing here is the V12 badge on the front part of this door trim next to the front wheel. V12, very subtle in there, but if you knew what you were looking for, you knew this was the flagship, the V12 S-Class. And indeed, if you saw that badge, you knew what was lurking under here, the big V12. In this case, a 5.8 liter naturally aspirated V12 made 360 horsepower. Now, that number doesn't seem too powerful by modern standards, and indeed, it wasn't actually all that powerful by the standards of this car either. This V12 was only used for 2 model years, 2001 and 2002. Then they replaced it with a turbo V12 that made almost 500 horsepower. And you would have probably been pretty upset if you had gotten one of these in 01 or 02, and then in 03 they came out with a version that had 130 more horsepower. Kind of a crappy thing for Mercedes-Benz to do, but they did it. I will say though, the naturally aspirated V12 version of this car, not as powerful, but probably more reliable than that twin turbo unit. This thing will probably run forever, at least by the standards of early 2000s Mercedes-Benz. By the way, one other cool touch in this area, you close the hood and you can see 3 windshield washer jets. 1 in the center, 2 on each side, 3 total. Your car only has 2, or maybe even 1 if it's crappy. You get 3 if you buy a V12 big body Benz. And so those are the quirks and features of the W220 Mercedes S-Class. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the W220 S600. Now, I mentioned before that the driving experience was one of the other drawbacks to this car. In addition to the quality and the styling, the driving experience. There are pros and cons to the driving experience. It wasn't as bad as the styling and the quality, but the biggest con was the car just didn't have the feeling of that like ultra bank vault tough, sturdy Mercedes-Benz like the W140 did. For a couple reasons. Number one, it just kind of felt looser and vaguer, and I actually think that the active body control was a reason for that. The car didn't really turn as much when it went around corners, and that almost felt a little bit unnatural. The steering was also very heavily boosted to make it as kind of luxurious and sweeping as possible, but the drawback to that was you didn't have that sort of sturdy feel like you were really turning the wheel on an important vehicle, you know? It felt more over-assisted and over-boosted and a little vaguer and a little floatier. There was a comfort benefit to this, but the drawback was it just didn't feel, everybody describes the 140 S-Class as feeling like a bank vault in terms of how sturdy it is. This car never really felt like that. Now, with that said, there are some big benefits here. One obvious one is it's incredibly comfortable. The suspension in this car is so good. The S-Class is and really has always been the car that I compare other luxury cars' suspensions to. I recently reviewed the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, and I just think to myself, you know, yeah, this is nice, but everybody else says it's like a super luxury car. It's no S-Class. And that's what you always think. The S-Class is like the gold standard luxury car of comfort. And getting in this one, even the worst S-Class, still feels really comfortable. Now, this is a pretty rare W220 S-Class, like I had mentioned. This one is in the rare 2-year period where they were doing a V12, but before they did the twin turbo V12, which then lasted for years and years and years, even under the next model and all that. I chose to review this one for 2 reasons. Number one, it's fully equipped, so I was able to kind of demonstrate everything, but also because this was kind of the early days of the W220. This is how they intended it. Later, they facelifted it and the car got better. The interior got nicer and they added more modern features, and it kind of just looked a little nicer. But this was like what they spent all these years developing the next S-Class, the one to replace the famed W140, and this was what they came up with. And it was a disappointment. Now, I do want to make one point here, though. This car was a disappointment from some perspectives. You know, the styling wasn't that great, the interior wasn't that great, the driving experience was fine, but not amazing. But it's still an S-Class. You know, to some extent, I liken this car to the 996 Porsche 911, which is sort of the low point of the Porsche 911 world. And coincidentally, they were produced for exactly the same years, 1999 to 2005. I consider these cars to be similar because they are the ones that nobody wants, but they still retain all of the benefits of the model. This is still a really nice luxury car that feels luxurious and high quality. I would have been proud to drive around in this back in 2001. And the 996 911 is the same way. It still drives like a 911, feels like a 911, it just is uglier and it was water cooled. And this is kind of that for the S-Class. It's still a very nice car, but it isn't. The rest of them were amazing, and this is very nice, and I think that's kind of the best way to say it. Now, as for the engine power here, it's fine. I mean, you floor it and it like moves pretty well, and it moves in a great way that Mercedes V12s do, which is it builds power somewhat subtly and doesn't just slap you in the face. Overall though, look, here's the thing. You know, this S-Class, I think it gets a bad rap in part because of the looks, because of the quality. It, at the end of the day, drives well. It's a nice car. It is still an S-Class. It also gets a bad rap, it's important to mention, because these have fallen into the hands of the seediest used car dealers, and they have air suspension jacked up in one corner and mismatched tires and panels, and you know, some of these are just in such rough shape. So when you see one of these, you don't just assume wealth or quality, and that's true of this car more than any other S-Class. Everyone that came before or after it still has a greater feeling of like, wow. This one you think, okay, well that person spent $8 grand on that, bought it on Craigslist, and it's probably got 6 fault codes on the dashboard. Although this one, I gotta admit, is pretty nice. And so that's the 2001 Mercedes-Benz S600. This was definitely the low point of the S-Class world, but that's a pretty high bar to set. At the end of the day, it's still an S-Class, it still has a V12, and it's still pretty nice, although there certainly are some drawbacks. Anyway, now it's time to give the W220 S600 a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the W220 S-Class, it just didn't look that good. That melty, curvy design made it look like a big Hyundai. It never had the presence of prior S-Class models, and while it wasn't ugly, it just wasn't an S-Class, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration is tough to pin down. Mercedes quoted 0 to 60 in the low 6s for this car, but magazines did it in the low 5s. I'll split the difference with a 4 out of 10. Handling was mediocre at best. It's very floaty and not designed for any sort of performance, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is even lower. This S600 hailed from the days before the V12 models got real power, so it's not particularly fast or engaging or thrilling, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. These W220 S-Class models just aren't cool. They certainly have the rep of being the worst S-Class, and it gets a 3 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 18 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This car was well equipped at the time, but it's starting to lag today, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Comfort is excellent. It does feel nice and luxurious inside, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Quality is only okay. Reliability has turned out to be fine, but interior materials are just unacceptable given the price point and the standards set by prior models, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and that's the one area where this car shines. These S-Classes are the least desirable S-Class models, but they're pretty cheap for what they offer. So this one gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 31 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 49 out of 100, which places this S600 here against rivals. Dead last, except for the prior generation S-Class, which is only 3 points behind despite being a decade older. And those 3 points are entirely made up in acceleration, since the newer model has way more power with the V12. The W220 was the worst S-Class ever, period, but I will say it's a great used bargain, and if you're looking for a cheap luxury car, this might be one of the best values.